Hey everyone, welcome to the Fan Lab, a limited series podcast that dives deep into the heartbeat of contemporary culture and commerce. I'm your host, Jonathan Hansen, the Chief Creative Officer of Unconquered, a creative agency unlocking the emotional power of fandom for brands. We created this podcast as an extension to a report we recently published called Decoding Fandom, that's available on our website at weareunconquered.co or linked in the show notes. From the world of music and entertainment to the realm of business valuations and technology, fandom has become one of the most powerful forces in brand building over the past few years. We've seen it transform brands through our work in sports, athletic apparel, and footwear, and we can see it across culture, showing up in the people lining up for Monster Energy tattoos to influencer-led brands like Prime Energy. Being a fan can be a profound connection that sparks a need to belong to something larger than ourselves, while also giving us a chance to embrace our own unique individuality. In this series, we talk with experts in contemporary culture and fandoms, exploring it from every angle. We hope to shed light on how brands can work within fandom as a marketing tool through insightful discussions on how brands can create lifelong connections with their audience. In our latest episode of the Fan Lab, I talk with Asia Romano, who's a culture reporter for Vox Media. We dive into the evolution of fandom, the stigma associated with it, and how brands can effectively engage with fans. Asia shares her personal journey into fandom and highlights the importance of authenticity and understanding fan communities. We also discuss the impact of technology, AI, and social media on fandom, as well as the challenges brands face when trying to navigate this space. The conversation explores examples of brands that have successfully embraced and rewarded their creators, such as Lego, Star Wars, and Disney, as well as provides valuable insights into the world of fandom and how brands can effectively engage with their fan communities. Good. All right, Asia, thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, I've been diving down into fandom, and as an agency, we've really been peeling back the layers as we think through how this concept and this idea can be applied to brands. And during our early process of developing our strategy practice, I found your writing, and I've just kind of gone all in. I've really enjoyed your perspective and just I would say the diversity of areas you focus on within culture and fandom. And I'm really, yeah, of course. And I'm really curious to how you found yourself interested in this topic.
Well, basically by doing it, essentially. I kind of stumbled into fandom. Basically, I grew up in a very isolated rural environment. I basically was on a farm in Tennessee, and the ways in which I connected to other fans was largely just in isolation through key moments of connection when I got to interact with other fans, which is rare. And by other fans at that point, I was mostly into just musical theater and so forth. But there were things like I would discover authors through the library and not realize that these authors were, beloved authors around the world with giant fandoms, because I was on a farm in Tennessee. What did I know? Like, there was no way of Googling it at the time. And so when I finally got to college and had regular internet access, I went all in on search engines. And immediately, one day I Googled, I think, Jane Austen, and immediately found myself at an early internet forum that was devoted to Jane Austen discussion, but also had a breakout fan fiction archive on the side, where it was full of all these people writing what we would now call modern AUs. And probably at the time we also call modern AUs. Basically, like, oh, it's Pride and Prejudice, but it's set in a figure skating rink, that kind of thing. And that was my introduction to fan fiction, and I was just immediately all in. And so, as a lifelong writer, that I had been one of those kids as a child who wrote fan fiction without realizing I was writing fan fiction, because I was just, I think that's something a lot of kids do just almost naturally. They ape the styles and the plots, and even, they want to continue the journeys of the characters that they read about. Right. So I was really kind of naturally primed for all of this, and then just really kind of cut my teeth on the internet at the moment that the internet was really finding itself and really evolving past, AOL and like news forums and things like that, like alt.net, and really the kind of early growth of online fandom coincided with so much of that, because as the platforms were evolving as internet platforms were evolving, so were the conversations around online fandom and who could perform online fandom, who could be in it, and what online fandom was allowed to do. And this was especially something that if you were, for example, on LiveJournal during the early 2000s, as I was, there was just a ton of like really adult conversation around the entire enterprise. And it was really hard not to take it seriously. And I took it seriously. And so what happened is that through my career, like I started out as a journalist working in a newsroom, as at the time there still were local newsrooms. And I basically just got started copy editing and then moved on from there to theater reviewing and so forth. And so I was doing a lot of freelance theater reviewing and entertainment reporting just here and there locally. But I was also doing a lot of blogging about fandom. And the thing that I did early on was to just start using fandom under my real name, which was a huge risk and not something that I think everybody can do. But I decided that the best way to kind of preempt people being shocked and horrified by my participation in fandom, because at the time it was still so scandalous, was to just own it. Because if I owned it and talked about it like it was any other hobby, which it was, then I found that the moment I did that, people immediately got it and were like, oh, and they became super interested in it. And so this thing that was kind of this big, scary, taboo subject, I was able to crack just by being open about it. And I still think to some degree that's true. I still find that some people want to treat it as this shameful, gross thing. And how dare I, talk about it under my own name. But for the most part, I think the society has really evolved to catch up with that mentality. And now we see, the potential of fandom. We see the benefits of fandom. And obviously we understand that millions and millions of people are participating in fandom in these ways. Right. So yeah. Basically that's how I got this career. I wrote myself into it by writing about fandom. And then I was invited to write for the Daily Dot, or first the Mary Sue and then the Daily Dot and then Vox. So yeah.
Great. So you mentioned a little about this, the idea of it being scandalous. I never personally, just from my, I'm obviously not as in tuned with it or has gone as deep as you have over the years. This is something that has really piqued my interest, I would say, and I've been digging over the last 6 months to a year. So, I'm still kind of a newbie in many ways, but I'm curious to why you think it's felt that it was scandalous.
Well, it definitely was, because I think for a number of reasons. The idea of fandom itself came to us from sports fandom, and sports fandom has always been legitimized in a way that pop culture fandom has not. There continues to be a giant divide there. And to some degree, I think that has changed, but not as much as you might think it would. And so the kind of taboo under the radar fandom basically came to us via sci-fi fandom from the 20s and 30s and 40s, when you had basically these groups of people, mostly straight white men, who were writing around these, really kind of what were considered niche geeky fiction writers, authors like H.P. Lovecraft, for example, who are considered masters of their craft today, were like really little known at the time, right? So the whole subject of sci-fi was something that was considered pretty niche and kind of nerdy, right? And I think that stereotype continued pretty well into, I would say, the 80s. There was this really famous SNL skit featuring William Shatner yelling at his own fans to get a life. And it really notoriously portrayed fans, the kind of what became, I think, the really quintessential stereotype of a fan for most of the 80s and 90s, which was this, nerdy, thick glasses wearing, trivia quoting Star Trek or Star Wars nerd at a convention, and this was considered really extreme. It was extreme behavior. It was considered abnormal. This was also the era of, Dungeons and Dragons and the Satanic Panic. So if your kid was interested in fantasy at all, lock them up because they were being influenced by Satan. So we laugh, but this was real stigma, and in some places still is a real stigma. So I think there was always the stigma that sort of associated with the idea of geek culture and geek fandom in general. And then to add to that, you had what women in fandom were doing, which was all kinds of deviant, scurrilous things involving fan fiction and queer characters and shipping and things that were just absolutely unheard of, even in quote unquote mainstream fandom, which was again all men, mostly all men and mostly all white people. So by the time all of this kind of came to a more visible, or gained a more visible status in the early 2000s, the move online of fandom really made so much of this tension visible, right? And allowed people to really discuss it. Obviously, it really allowed geek culture to begin mainstreaming itself. And you had the Lord of the Rings fantasy kind of doing that work for us, along with Harry Potter, the two main flagship fandoms of that era, right? That were really what enabled fans to kind of become mainstream very quickly, right? Within pop culture, at least fantasy fans. And I think once we'll talk about Marvel, obviously we'll talk about Marvel a lot, but I think between the era of Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, and Marvel, you definitely still had this idea that there was the curatorial side of fandom, which was sort of the part that was still run by, I shouldn't say run, but like the part that was still mostly inhabited by all of these male geeks, right? That side of fandom kind of really being validated and being mainstreamed, while the more female and queer and genderqueer, and I would even arguably add people of color, the fandom most likely to be inhabited by people of color, that side of fandom, which I would think of as the transformative side, that side of fandom was still pretty much in the dark, in the shadows. It was still considered taboo. It was still considered something you couldn't do under your own name, and in many ways still isn't considered something you can do under your own name. But I think today there's much more of an awareness that transformative side of fandom is where many of the geeks live, and where many of our writers live, and where many of our creators live. I think especially with the rise both of Marvel fandom and with the rise of Tumblr, transformative fandom has kind of become the way in which, how to say this, the type of fandom that gets most quickly translated into the mainstream these days is actually probably coming from transformative fandom and from Tumblr and from that whole ethos. Does that make sense?
It does. And I also think there's almost like a commerce side of it. I think there's been a point now where some of the mainstream adoption has come from the brands themselves seeing the opportunity and trying to drive the conversation, right? And at the same time, I think that's where there's the potential for it to really fall off the rails, and that it can become these enterprises, these big brands, if you will, talking down instead of talking with. And I'm curious too, when you think through it and you think through that relationship, what do you think these brands are getting wrong when they start talking with fans? Or like you even mentioned fan fiction. Like I don't write fan fiction, but I'm a big fan of fan fiction simply because I love the idea of co-creation and evolving and giving people an opportunity to own something, and maybe even see themselves in the work that they're writing, and being this form of self-expression. So it's just going back to that question. It's what do you see where they're going wrong with that?
It's a really complicated question, and I think it's only gotten more complicated over time for a bunch of different reasons. I want to go back to the idea that the commerce fandom has become a thing, and I think that's definitely true, right? Because you have one of the other things, the other big mainstreaming factors I didn't mention was Comic-Con, right? Because Comic-Con not only brought all sides of fandom together, or at least, mostly English fandom together, English language rather, but it also kind of really gave a real new room for brands to kind of talk to fans directly, and really interact with them via this convention space. So it was like this real world way of forming bonds and attachments. and you look at brands like Funko and how they benefited from that, and you can really see, that this made a huge difference, right? So I think one thing to think about when we think about fans interacting with brands is that they want to see that brands have the same priorities they do, right? And that brands are willing to go where they are. I think the brands that are on Tumblr, the brands that listen to Tumblr and kind of follow Tumblr's lead have been really successful at this. Because I think there's a lot of mockery, for example, of brands on Twitter, because brands on Twitter and sometimes on Instagram too often come across as having a really inauthentic voice, like they're trying to ape what being a cool fan sounds like.
Exactly.
But they just sound off and stilted, and like they're being written by a terrible AI or something, or like an underpaid social media intern. And I think that inauthenticity really stands out, and fans can see it immediately. I think too, there is also a sense from brands that, how to say this, that they get to control how the conversation goes, if that makes sense.
Yes, totally.
I see a lot of times that brands want to interact with fans, but then they don't enjoy the interaction. So they either shut the conversation down, or they will, cancel the entire project or whatever. When I think a better way to do that is probably to, do a lot of test groups first, so you understand what you're getting into, and really understand which part of fandom you're working with, because fandom is really vast and diverse. It's more vast and diverse than ever, especially these days. And there are more kind of niche pockets, if that makes sense, niche like subgroups.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And they don't always agree, and they don't always, even within fandoms, they don't always see their canon or their pop star the same way. Right. So depending on who you're trying to reach, you might have a number of different pitfalls to avoid. So I think brands should really be aware that those pitfalls exist to begin with, and really kind of study and be careful about how they want to try and approach fans. And then ideally they let the conversation evolve naturally, instead of trying to, force their own version of themselves onto fandom. It might be better to interact with fans more naturally and let fans drive that evolution, because fans will, and we see this all the time, especially creative fans, they'll make fan art of the brands that they love. They'll do memes, they'll do fan art, they'll do fanfic, they'll really kind of try and own that part of interaction as much as they can. At the same time, we also have to be aware that fans are really concerned about things like things like progressivism and equality, and most fans, I would say, are on the progressive side because of the kind of fandoms that they're in. Not all, certainly, but enough so that conversations of like any conversation that is socio-political is going to skew, I would say, at least centrist or liberal, right? And so that's another thing for brands to be aware of. It's rare that we get a situation like the Bud Light fiasco from the other day, but but also I think we might be seeing more of those, depending on what brand we're talking about. So yeah.
I'm curious. We've talked a little bit about technology and how that really, how I think sounds like really spawned your interest and fueled the depth of which you're able to go and connect with others. And it seems, we've talked about also these niche communities and how I think technology is really allowing these people to find these niche communities. And, over the last, 6 months, AI has been a huge theme. We're seeing all sorts of, you've seen the demise of Twitter and that community start to fall apart a little bit. And Substacks now, coming into play, and we have all these new opportunities to connect. I'm curious to what your thoughts are on like where you see fandom going in relationship to technology, and as technology evolves, how it's going to either inhibit or grow those fandoms.
Yeah, I think And this kind of gets into something that I didn't really touch on regarding the kind of brand opportunism question, which is that especially in transformative fandom, fans are extremely wary of any type of attempt to exploit, quote unquote, exploit their works or their communities. And so within the fanfic community, as we've been seeing this whole AI boom, I don't know if you've been following it or if you've noticed or heard, but there was this huge pushback against sorry, there's noise outside of my apartment. I'm sorry.
I don't hear it. You're quite all right.
Okay, that's good. There was this huge pushback against AIs scraping AO3 for data. Yes. So basically, it hasn't really been proven, but it seems to be the case that Chat GPT and other AIs were using data sets that came from, the vast amount of free repositories of content on the internet, right? Well, the AO3 is one of the biggest free repositories of content. And fans were basically running tests to kind of see what their AIs knew about fan fiction concepts. And it seems like at this point, the AIs know all about fan fiction. But this was really alarming for a lot of fans. And so they started to lock their fics. They started to basically try and put disclaimers on their fics being like, don't scrape my content, etc., to try and kind of counteract this idea that the AI is basically using their content and exploiting their content without their knowledge or permission. And I think that really is the way that most fandom tends to react to things like this, to these types of technologies. You do have some people that are all in, and you'll always have people that are all in. But I think for the most part, especially on AO3, because AO3 is such a very kind of, it sees itself as, the community sees itself as like the last bastion of protection against the deep exploitation of the internet in a lot of ways, right? You'll see people being very aloof and leery and wary of all types of attempts to kind of come into fandom spaces by say crypto or AI tech or any type of big tech or corporation, right? Like there's just an inherent skepticism there. I think the AI boom is something I almost don't feel comfortable commenting on because it is happening so fast. It's exploding so rapidly. And I think that there have been so little safeguards put in place that should be put in place. This is not an instance where move fast and break things is ideal. We want to be very slow and thoughtful about how we proceed. And I don't think that's happening at all. So, and because AI we've seen exactly how fast and rapidly all of this is developing, right? And I don't think we're even sure how fast it's going to develop. So I feel like making a prediction about where it's going to go, it could be.
Well, predictions are hard because if you're wrong, people they criticize you, and if you're right, they say, "Oh, that was easy. You can see the writing on the wall." So predictions are always difficult.
Yeah, but we already know that it's able to ape fiction pretty well, right? Like we've seen that already. I just from the little that I've tried it, I've been really impressed at the way it's able to write and characterize. Like I asked it for a characterization once as a test. I wasn't even using Chat GPT. I was using an AI that was being marketed specifically for this particular tool. Like it was being marketed as a fiction writing tool, right? So I just asked it to describe a character, and it gave me this really vivid description of a character, and I was really impressed. And that was before Chat GPT. And so I think that we're already seeing that AI is doing a lot of the work of the actual content production that could be done by fans themselves, right? But obviously what can't be replaced is the interactivity and the communion and the camaraderie and the debate and even the fights and the ship wars and the kind of stringent crusading that happens in the fandom. I mean, you can manipulate that. Obviously, we're also seeing bots manipulate that. Like the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial was kind of this unholy mingling of bots manipulating fans and fans warring against each other, right? So so we're seeing that a lot of this interaction is unprecedented, and that the growth is staggering and a little overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah, when I think about this, the scraping side of it, it does call to at least it calls attention to me. It reminds me of just the human side of how we kind of do the same thing when we create. I mean, I almost think there's like some kind of irony in there, in that like for example, before I started started the agency, I was a freelance photographer working for magazines and newspapers, and the way I got into that is I found photographers I loved, and that was my entry point. And I studied and I studied and studied, and you take little pieces and you learn and you grow. And there's this idea of like you're mentally scraping all the work and your own influences, and then you do kind of come out on your own in the end. But there was a phase where I was very much copying as a way of learning to my idols. And when I think and what I think is interesting is like when we hear the fear, like Getty I think is suing an AI developer for its scraping of their images, which I think is interesting because as I just said, it's kind of like almost a human learning process or personal exploration of when you start even fan fiction in itself.
Absolutely,
is part of that.
I think the difference though is that like when you're doing that on your own and you're going through your own journey, there's not a copyright issue there. Whereas fans are always in danger of having basically they write under the grace of fair use. But fan fiction as a medium has never been tested in court. So the goal is always to try and just fly under the radar. And I think that the skepticism and fear largely comes from long experience in years past of works being ceased and desisted, which is basically, if anybody isn't familiar with that, like a C&D is when you get a copyright notice to take down your content, or your IP host does it for you. There's a long history within those kind of early years of fandom of entire archives being deleted overnight because a hosting service got a C&D order and they didn't know what they were doing, so they just took the whole archive down because they thought it was legal, right? So AO3 exists to prevent that by explicitly protecting fans under the banner of fair use. So I think the idea that emerged from that is that fans need to have direct control over their own content so that they can control the way that it gets presented, because what if an AI starts writing fanfic, then how does that work under copyright, right? So it's kind of an evolving question, and I'm sure we're going to be dealing with it a lot more in the future, but I think that's where it all comes from.
And we talked a little bit about this, and I think it's in theme, is this idea of co-creation. And I feel like some brands have really owned it, and others have been really scared, as we've touched on a little bit, and kind of just avoided the conversation altogether. But I would love to hear if you have any examples in mind where you think they really honored and rewarded their creators for their work that they did. There's some, I was on Lego's website. I was a huge Lego nut when I was a kid, and I just to see that the brand evolve I've grown older, and they've really, I think, embraced their big fans and fans of other enterprises by allowing them to submit their own designs, giving them royalties, having the whole community upvote them, which then gets them in front of the creative team and to make those decisions of what happens. And to me, that's I think it's a great example. But I'm curious if you have any in your mind that just sort of ring true.
Absolutely. I was going to bring up Lego as one of my picks as well, because I do think they are so good at embracing fans, and they really get that that fandom can be a generative space, right, for this. I think Star Wars, to a large degree, has also done this. Star Wars has always been really good about, elevating fan art and fan works and fan writers and even like fan trivia nerds, and really kind of giving them spaces to feel valued. I think Disney also probably, I mean, you can say a lot of things, both positive and negative, about Disney, but they really do understand their fans well. And, you could argue they made a whole movie for furry fans. So like they know their audience really well, and they know how to interact with them in ways that power the brand, as it were. I think Netflix, for the most part, is doing pretty well at this. They're kind of struggling. They've struggled, I think, with their fan platform, Tadum. But I think that's mostly about the branding, right? And not about their ability to cultivate fan loyalty. So I kind of feel like they will get there eventually. There, in smaller spaces, there are a lot of really like small presses that have done really well, a lot of small comics fandoms that are comics brands that have done really well, for example, in cultivating their fans, especially as comics fandom has kind of boomed over the last decade. There are a lot of manga publishers, for example, that are also really good at things like Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll is excellent at interacting with fans and giving fans a space to feel like they have that they can interact and exert ownership over the Crunchyroll kind of content. I think that those things are kind of born out of geek culture in a lot of ways, but we also see it too with things like Nike. Like Nike is obviously very good at responding to its fans. I think a lot of this is, you kind of see it sort of on both ends. Like on the very small niche end, you find success, and on the very huge corporate end with tons of resources to really dig into like the micro analytics of all this, you also see success, right? I don't know necessarily where that leaves brands that are kind of in the middle. But I think that the thing that all of those brands have in common is attention. They just pay a lot of attention to their fans, and they listen and understand them. Right. Yeah, exactly. They listen, and they also value the creativity. I think that's another thing, because we've seen other attempts to interact with fandom kind of go off the rails, because the brands that were trying to do those types of creative interactions didn't understand what the fans wanted. And when they found out what the fans wanted, they were like, oh no, this isn't what we expected. We didn't expect you to like start bringing queer ships into our very heterogeneous space that's about celebrating characters. You have to kind of be aware of that stuff and prepare for it, and then either find ways to incorporate it or make a space for it that doesn't leave fans feeling like you're censoring or shutting them out, or blocking out parts of the conversation, basically.
Yeah, what I think is interesting is we've been talking a lot, when we talk about a lot of the fandom discussion we've been having seems to be kind of, if you look at like the fandom journey of someone, seems to be the most controversy, or at least difficulty with change, seems to be happening like in that later stage. Like if we look at maybe like the introduction, the early exploration as being quote like a tourist, and then like maybe the end, or I won't say the end, but the more extreme part of the spectrum being the champion. It seems like there's more of that unwanted change happening later in that relationship with it. Would you agree with that?
I don't really think so, because like I reported on this on the Outlander fandom once, and the Outlander fandom was full of women who had never been in fandoms before, and they were all in their and like on average they were all in their mid-40s. So these were women who had no experience of outside this one fandom at all. Like they had basically all showed up for this TV show that they'd fallen in love with, and so their fandom dynamics were kind of like, I don't know, like an anthropologist's dream, because they were kind of in their own isolated space, right? They weren't really influenced by an ongoing fan. Like most of them were not lifelong fans, which fully surprised me, because I would think that, these would be full of like longtime romance fans with tons of fan fiction, days behind them, but, or, things like that. But no, they were all kind of brand new. And their fandom dynamics were fully formed from the outset, so I think a lot of this is down to where you kind of wind up, quote unquote, as a fan. Some of it is down to your individual trajectory, I think, through fandom. A lot of it is also, I think, down to which social media platforms you end up and how those social media platforms enable or discourage various types of behaviors. For example, if you're a fan on Instagram, you are probably much less likely to engage in mass brigading or harassment, because you're not on Twitter and there's not a hashtag at your disposal, right? Like your interaction is more actively going to be about interacting with the brand or interacting with the influencer, right, that you like, kind of one-on-one. And you might talk to other fans to some extent via DM, but you're not going to have like a community, etc. You're going to have to go outside Instagram for that, right?
That's a really interesting perspective. I didn't think about it that way.
Well, I think it depends. Like, honestly, I don't think that you're wrong. I don't think that, I do think that to some degree that as you go through fandom, you find your way around more, so you get more into things that you like, and more about how to navigate the space, right? So it makes sense that you would become more invested as you go along. But I also think that there are lots of lifelong fans who never get that far, that, they stay casual fans. They go to Comic-Con once every few years, or to Dragon Con or wherever. And that's their way of doing fandom. They're content to, maybe they read a subreddit every once in a while, but they interact mainly with the canon and enjoying and appreciating their particular media. Right. And I'm that way with different things. Like, for example, if you asked me, I'd say I'm a huge True Detective fan, but in reality, my way of performing True Detective fandom was by obsessively reading subreddits and lurking and never really stepping outside that role. Like I think I've commented all of twice ever on a True Detective subreddit, and I'm not interested in reading fan fiction about it. That's just not my thing. Like, I just want to kind of interact with the canon and the literature around it and read all the meta theories, and that's fine. And I'm never gonna own, like, I don't know, a Rust Cole mug or something. Like, whereas with Harry Potter, I spent years in that fandom and had all the books, had all, like, not all, but several pieces of merchandise, and obviously was a huge fanfic writer. So I think a lot of it is really contextual and dependent on the individual fan, and also where they are in their life journey.
Yeah, I found myself in a very similar position that you just described, where I get kind of like personally obsessed, but not to the point where I'm having conversations online. I may indulge it in my own way. For example, like I love Seinfeld, and it's something that's probably on my TV all the time. I would say every day it's playing at one point in the day. And in the credits, it's New York based, and they have they show some of the facades of New York. And there's a restaurant in my neighborhood. I live on the Upper West Side, home to Jerry and Elaine.
Oh, nice.
And they show this restaurant Pappardella, and as I think they try and place it as Poppy's restaurant, but I actually went there 2 weeks ago just because I was like, oh, it's still around. It's on the show. I have to go there and try it.
That's so cool.
And I think that's been probably one of the more, I don't even want to say extreme, but the most I've gone out to experience and be a part of something bigger, versus like making it more just for me or my close friends who happen to be really into it as well. So as I go through and I read more and I think about our conversation, I always try to place myself, because you have the extremes of like the stans and the folks that are out there who are really into it. But for me, it's always been like I think a time commitment. It's hard for me to make the room for things like that, and I'm always really fascinated by the people who it's that important to them, where they carve out huge chunks of time of their day to engage and do it.
Yeah, it is. And there have been moments when I just haven't been able to devote as much time to fandom as I'd like because, of various real life commitments and so forth. And you kind of do have to have a balancing act. And sometimes you pull away. I know a lot of fans who kind of gradually moved away from fandom, not by choice, but just because real life took them other directions and they didn't have as much time for fandom. And I think that happens a lot. But also, I think a lot of people think that you can kind of come back whenever you want, depending on what your latest obsession is and how involved you get. I think to some extent that's true, but again, it's just different for everybody. I wouldn't necessarily, I don't think you have to have necessarily a limit or a maximum amount of time or like a minimum amount of time. That makes, I mean, even if you like something from afar, I think that counts. I've had discussions with friends about what constitutes quote unquote being in fandom. And I tend to err on like the very lazy side of just being like, if you like the thing, you're the fan and you're part of the fan community, no matter how big or small, right? So
well, I tend to err on that side. I tend to be on that side as well. I don't.
Yeah.
And I do wonder by, I think sometimes even just putting that word fan up, it automatically either puts, defense mechanisms, and heightened, being like, oh, just because of the label that is associated with that label.
Yeah, this is why I also really hate the word super fan. Like I hate it. Like I catch myself using it more and more lately, but I don't like it. I just think it's a really I find it a commodified way to describe something that every fan does, or is likely to do. So,
well, I think it also, at least from my perspective, it seems to have negative connotations when you call someone a super fan, because obviously we've seen cultural examples where super fans can behave in really horrible ways. And I think when you classify people as super fan, at least for me, I automatically think like, oh, they're going to be part that's going to go after the folks that don't necessarily prescribe to their idea of what fans should be doing, right?
Right. Well, I think the problem, I think there's an underlying problem that you've identified here, which is that we don't really have good terms for like different kinds of fans and different types of fan behaviors and activities. Because like, to the best of my knowledge, super fan was kind of an invented marketing term that was originally meant to be a positive, description of a fan who is extremely active and they're extremely commodified. They spend lots of money on the fandom that they're in, and they spend lots of hours and active time in that fandom or on that fandom idol, whatever it is. And so in marketing terms, it was meant to be kind of like, here's your target audience. You want the super fans, that's who you want to engage with. But the moment that term hit the media, it immediately became a way of, I think, pejoratively describing fandom and fans, and which is part of what's wrong with it, because I think that to some degree, any type of word that we put out there is going to be used that way, right? Like, because the media is going to do what it does, and it's going to like stereotype and
put a box around it.
Yeah, it's gonna try and label things and present fans in ways that are extreme. I think K-pop is such a really good example of this, because for the longest time, K-pop fans and media were just so they were just belittled and mocked in every possible way. Even as they were, arguably changing the music industry and changing streaming, certainly, and changing international fandom, and wave after wave after it, just so many ways K-pop fandom has changed the world, honestly. And doing it completely without any type of respect at all from mainstream media, especially in the US. And then the moment that BTS fans started to, and K-pop fans started to like fuck with Trump in 2020, suddenly, finally, at last, all the media was like, K-pop fandom is good now. It's just, it's like, they were always doing what they were doing. Like, it's not like they suddenly became something that was good once you could weaponize them against Trump, right? Like, but I think that type of experience is probably going to keep happening for different fan communities, especially as we see the, the internationalization of fandom becoming more and more mainstream and more common. I think we're going to see a lot of that type of really writing off whole communities until they do something that you like.
Yeah,
or
totally.
that at least that you understand, something that you understand and want to weaponize. So
yeah, we're getting a little close on time, and I just want to, I think, close maybe with one more question. And I'm really curious to, we talked a little bit about this a few minutes ago when I was talking through maybe the resistance to change. And I'm curious. I think there is a point where creators may get nervous or be hesitant to try and evolve characters. I think ultimately, like, great storytelling is this: you see this evolution of a character, and maybe they start as one thing and you get to watch them change and become something else. And how you can sort of stick to this idea of great storytelling with while trying to still balance and not disrupt the ecosystem or the fandom around that helps support the brand in itself. And how you think, I'm wondering I know it's a very difficult question, I think, and it's one where I'm just curious, in your experience, if there are case studies or anything that you think where, properties, brands have been able to navigate that well.
I'm thinking.
One thing that comes to mind, and
all the examples I can think of are bad ones. So
yeah, I know I think that the negative ones get a lot more attention than the more positive ones. But I think from a recent example, I think of the Last of Us as maybe one, where they had, I didn't play the game. I don't really do video games myself, but it seems like they really added to that conversation or into that world, instead of allowing the fandom to dictate it. They kind of added to it through the creation of the film, and the series, and they got me into it.
Yeah, they got really. Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say that they got really thoughtful and creative with the world building of that show, and there was an extremist pocket of the Last of Us fans who were mad that the series wasn't more quote unquote like the video game. But they really banked on the part of fandom that was there, not for like the violent gameplay mechanics, and that was there for the world building and the storytelling, and that really paid off for them, right? So I think there's value also in just knowing which fans are worth listening to and which aren't, so
totally,
which is really important. I mean, look at the Bud Light thing. Like you need to know which fans you're gonna
piss off and ones you're okay with. I mean,
yeah, this is going to be the continuing conversation of the era
absolutely.
as far right politics and ideologies grow more and more mainstream. They're also finding more and more spaces within fandom, right? So that's definitely going to be something that brands will have to listen to or be aware of and decide how they want to proceed with, because those voices are going to be out there. But in terms of storytelling, obviously, I think not listening to those people is good. I also think the Heartstopper fandom on Netflix, I think Heartstopper was not a show that I think anybody expected to do as well as it did. But the creator of Heartstopper has a long fandom pedigree. And she had written other stories that were actually more actively about being in fandom, and specifically being in queer fandom. So I think that kind of set itself up to do really, really well with fans, and did do really well with fans, because the adaptation was really faithful to the story, and it also kind of really understood fandom tropes and what fans wanted to see. So I would say that one is a really good example. Disney just in general is really good at not always. I will say not always. It tends to be hit and miss. Pixar certainly is very good at really kind of giving fans what they want with every new succeeding story in a franchise. Turning Red, I think, is an excellent example of a story that was organically created by by listening to the transformative fangirl in all of us, basically, right? Rather than kind of shutting it down and being like, this is shameful, we shouldn't pay any attention to this specific group of fans. They kind of honored that spirit and made an entire movie about like 90s fangirls and in Toronto, and also honored a specific diaspora experience. And I think that movie kind of tells you you don't necessarily have to have like a legacy franchise to do that sort of thinking and creating with, you just have to be aware that fandom exists and take it seriously and respect it, and you'll find plenty of ways to kind of use that to augment your storytelling, I think.
Oh, I think that word right there, respect, is a key piece to a lot of what we've talked about today, is how brands can really honor that as showing their fans respect. I love that idea. Asia, where can listeners find you on social?
I am on, well, I'm on Twitter like everybody else, but who knows how long Twitter is going to exist at this point. But I'm on Twitter at Asia Romano. I'm on Tumblr at Bookshop, and on Vox, obviously, under my byline at Asia Romano. And that's about it. You can also find me on LinkedIn, etc., if you need to. Which I am very ambivalent about all of those more those more adult commercialized spaces, but I'm there as well. I'm pretty much everywhere as either my real name or under the Fandom handle Bookshop. So that's it.
All right, Asia. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed the conversation and appreciate your perspective.
Yes, no problem. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening into the Fan Lab. We hope you've enjoyed our deep dive into the cultivating world of fandom. And as we continue to explore it, we invite you to take the next step with us. Head on over to our website and download our newest report, Decoding Fandom. It's full of insights and case studies telling the story of how fandom can create long-term value for brands. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and stay tuned to our next episode.